Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurum-īśvaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Murakelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudabam Murdnani Patyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Yashri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kado Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadana-strinam dantoyer yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhyudisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasyati Bhalashvavarashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdhanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajanola Samanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Chetasamme Chittam Satam Nirupari Yatu Parapadme Ya Bhakti Bhaktir Ya Nikilarta Varga Janani Ya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bhajayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Kurya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Tasyai Nam Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Yaram Yanikilaga Sangha Shamani Shrotratritim Sangata Ya Swadhyai Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hiraye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mahita Dhanye Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. And in particular, we go further into our discussion of this final verse cited by Sri Rupa Pad in the section on Sotsukya Prarthana, or prayers full of eagerness, which is the fourth verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam. So, in our last reading, we discussed the significance of Sriman Mahaprabhu praying for causeless bhakti, and how the import of this is that it's only when one has causeless bhakti, or when one has desirelessness of everything other than bhakti, that one can engage in Krishna Sankirtan with humility greater than a blade of grass, with tolerance like a tree, with respectfulness towards everyone, and without any conceit on one's own part. So the manner of taking the name that was described in the third verse is achieved by having the state of the psyche, the state of one-pointed desire and prayer, that is depicted in the fourth verse. So this is where we left off with some references to other statements in the Sindhu. So now we're going to go further on this point for the pounding the post purpose, because this is so central to the path of sadhana bhakti and as laid out in the context of Uttama Bhakti by Sri Rupa. Then we'll look at why it is that we struggle with this and how it is that even knowing this, we still don't manage to actually do it. And we'll look at examples in the Bhagavatam and elsewhere where we find examples of such struggle as well as explanation of why it takes place, which ultimately further reiterates the value and importance of daily consistent practice and cultivation of such prayer and of such practices that support that attunement of the psyche, or that gradual purification of the psyche into a state of one-pointedness upon bhakti and Bhagavan. So, with that, I'll begin from the top of the fresh file. A common instance of the opposite, that is, employing bhakti in pursuit of attaining various worldly objects, so as to attain personal worldly satisfaction and avoid suffering, can be seen in the Argala Stotra from the Durga Saptashati in Markandeya Purana, that is often recited by Bhaktas of Durga Devi during annual Durga Puja festivities. So especially here in West Bengal, where the Durga Puja is the biggest holiday of the year, a little bit the way in Europe or the United States, Christmas is sort of the quintessential cultural holiday. So in the context of modern West Bengal society, Durga Puja is the celebration of the year. And in such celebrations, there's a standard prayer which is recited. So every, so to speak, every Bengali will go off to the temple this week and will have some priest recite this stotra on their behalf, which is sometimes called the Argala Stotra, and originates here in the Markandeya Puran. So for weeks, or not weeks, but for nearly a week here in West Bengal, you can hear this stotra being repeated again and again on loudspeakers, so many times as people attend the different functions and conduct puja on behalf of themselves or their families or what have you. So what's to be noted is what is the object of this prayer, and how does it compare with the prayer made in the verse of Mahaprabhu in the fourth verse in Shikshastakam. So the contrast will be evident. In this stotra, a long string of repeated requests are made for the very objects that Sriman Mahaprabhu categorically negates desiring in the verse under discussion, as well as various common objects desired in the world, such as good health and an abundance of pleasures. The following is one of over 20 verses in the stotra that repeatedly states the same final four requests. So the verse, it goes like this: Dumra netra bodhe devi dharma kamarta dayini Rupam dehi, jayam dehi, yasho dehi, dvisho jahi. O slayer of Dhurma Netra, that is, O Durga, O Devi, O bestower of Dharma, Kama, and Artha, please grant me beauty, grant me victory, grant me fame, please destroy my enemies. So this, Rupam dehi, jashom dehi, like this, you hear this again and again and again as it echoes throughout the whole stotra. So what can we see? We can see that Mahaprabhu says, don't give me wealth. And this verse says, give me wealth. Mahaprabhu says, don't give me followers. So this verse says, give me fame. Or in other words, give me that which causes me followers. Here it says, Mahaprabhu says, don't desire beautiful women. This one says, make me beautiful. There's another verse specifically in the stotra later which says, give me a beautiful wife. So I didn't quote that one here because, O bestower of dharma, kama, and artha is more, so covers the whole, represents the stotra as a whole. So I just use this as an example. But there's another one where precisely what Mahaprabhu says, na sundarīṁ, it says, manorama bharjam dehi, give me a beautiful wife. And when he says kavitāṁ, don't give me, poeticism or that which leads to fame or the attainment of wealth or the attainment of status in society, then here he's saying, give me victory, give me fame. So, some people, I've seen in some Western contexts, this stotra is sometimes reinterpreted to be a spiritual prayer for spiritual beauties, victory over one's vices, and greatness in the sense of being a good person or being a virtuous person and overcoming the internal enemies of lust and anger and greed. And some people may make it out as though it's something that's not quite as abjectly focused specifically on the Trivarga, but that's again the reason that I chose this as an example, because by saying, give me dharma, kama, and artha, it's very clear that the original intent and context of these prayers is entirely something that we call sakama or kamya. It's specifically related to, desire for these worldly objects. And so when he says, destroy my enemies, he's not just talking about, don't let me become too angry when someone bothers me. He's literally praying that, whoever his rival is in society be killed. This is, the classical context within the Purana of what the intended sense is. But no harm in people taking a more benign or adjusted approach to the stotra, if they so wish. That's another thing. That's not our concern directly. But I just present this as an example where you have a direct prayer stated with literal the opposite of what Mahaprabhu has prayed for. What Mahaprabhu is precisely negating and saying, I don't want these things. Here you have the prayer recited literally thousands and thousands of times at the biggest festival that happens in the entire year. That's like the, cornerstone of the modern culture, is literally an anthem praying for, those very things that Mahaprabhu advises one not to desire. So this is the social context of today's West Bengal, where our Gaudiya Vaishnava Dharma, where Sriman Mahaprabhu has, originally come to offer his wonderful teachings. So we'll now unpack why it might not be wise to recite this prayer, as culturally acceptable as it may be. Is it really acceptable from the viewpoint of the Bhagavatam? Does it really classify as being a wise manner of prayer and celebration? So let's see what Mahaprabhu and the Bhagavatam have to say more about this. When prayed to in this way, both Durga Devi and Bhagavan Sri Krishna can overlook the superficiality of the prayer being made and graciously give a worshipper the opportunity to take to the path of pure bhakti, instead of using bhakti merely as a means of pursuing worldly objects and thereby obtaining merely desired worldly objects. Okay, sorry, I'll have to fix that. But so the point we want to make here is that because Bhagavan as well as Durga Devi are benevolent and they, see persons in, covered over by relative degrees of beginningless ignorance, praying to them in various ways, they know that this might not be wise things for these persons to want, just as, in a modern Western context, sometimes kids might ask their parents for certain presents for Christmas or presents for their birthday, which might not be entirely the best things that those kids could have. So the parents might decide not to give the kid precisely what they want, but rather give them something that would actually be good for them. So just as a parent, out of their caring for the child, may have this type of sensibility, then, this type of sensibility is certainly not lost on Bhagavan himself, or when he's prayed to, he can certainly see the futility of the desire that the person has that's motivating them to make the prayer for whatever object it may be. So this is how it's perceived on the receiving end. On the desirer's end, it might seem like a very sensible and important and keenly wanted thing. Give me this. But how do they actually look in the eyes of whom they're praying to? So Sriman Mahaprabhu describes this as follows in his teachings to Sri Sanatana Pad in Varanasi. So these payars are as follows. Anya kami jadi kore Krishna rabajan, na magiteo Krishna tare dena swacharan. Krishna kohe amai bhaje, mage vishaya suk, amrita chari visha mage e bhoramurk. Ami vigyai murke vishay kene dibo, swacharan amrita diya vishaya bulaibo. Kama lagi Krishna bhaje pai Krishna rase, kam chari das hoite hoy abhilashe. If a desirer of other objects performs worship of Krishna, Krishna gives him his own feet, even though he did not ask for them. Krishna says to himself when worshipped by those seeking objects other than himself, he worships me but asks for the pleasure of sense objects. He rejects nectar and asks for poison. He is a great fool. I, however, am wise. So why should I give this fool objects of the senses? I will give him the nectar of my own feet and cause him to forget the objects of the senses. One who worships Krishna for the sake of a desired object thus ultimately attains Krishna rasa. One who then forsakes the desired object initially sought and acquires the desire to become a servant of Krishna. So this final statement is a broad, generous observation. In other words, when the person comes seeking something else, then despite the fact that they seek something else, Krishna graciously arranges for them to not get what they want, but really get what's good for them. And so ultimately, when they come for the wrong reason, by Krishna's benevolence, they end up getting what is most beneficial for them, a taste and experience of Krishna himself, of Bhakti to himself. And when they get that experience, or they taste that superior rasa, or that superior joy, then the thing they initially sought, they forsake that, and they want only to be a servant of Krishna. In other words, to carry on relishing that satisfaction of service to him. So this analysis that he gives is based on a verse in Bhagavatam. So that verse in Bhagavatam is as follows. Satyam dishatyartitam artito nrinam naivartado yat punarartita yataha swayam vidate bhajatam anichatam icha pidanam nijapada palavam. It is true that Bhagavan grants the desired objects of human beings when requested by them to do so. He is not, however, a bestower of objects from which further requests arise. Thus, he of his own accord offers undesirous worshippers the blossoms of his feet, which cover over all other desires. So he does give people what they want, but better than that, he gives them what's actually good for them. such that the desire for anything beyond that evaporates because they now have something truly satisfying and therefore they don't desire anything more than that. So Jiva Gosvami, he has explained this topic as follows. Upon being requested, it is certainly true that Sri Bhagavan bestows the requested object of human beings. There is never any irregularity in this regard, is the meaning. But, even in this regard, he is not munificent just by means of that. Meaning he does not give just that and desist. Since when the cessation of the enjoyment of the previously bestowed object occurs, because of the worshippers being unfulfilled with that object after experiencing it for some time, then the worshipper again becomes a requester of him for another object. As per the statement in Bhagavatam 9:19-14, quote, desire is never extinguished by enjoyment of objects of desire. It is only again further increased thereby, like a fire by oblations. So just as you can keep adding things to fire and it just keeps burning and doesn't have any diminished capacity to burn the next piece of wood you add, once it's already burned one, it can burn another with just as much power, with just as much consistency as the previous one. So desire can just burn on through object after object after object after object. So when someone is beset with that fire inside their psyche, then does it really serve them? Is it really good for them to just chuck another log on the fire and let them burn through that, and then chuck another one, and then chuck another one, and then the process never ends? So rather, to really help the person is to extinguish the fire, not just to keep adding wood to it. So this is the idea, that Bhagavan will extinguish that desire for more and more objects by giving them an object that truly satisfies them such that they don't desire anything else. So thus, in this way intended, he who is verily supremely compassionate bestows specifically his own bud-like feet upon even those worshippers of himself who are undesirous of them, as a result of ignorance of the sweetness of those bud-like feet, which are covering of their desires, that is, which are fulfilling of all their desires. As a mother removes clay being chewed from the mouth of a child, and places a piece of sugar candy there, like that he removes those objects his worshippers desire, and bestows his feet upon them, which his worshippers find to be completely fulfilling, and thus retain no further desire for the objects they previously desired, just as a child gives up desire to chew clay after experiencing the sweet taste of sugar candy. This is the purport. So, someone's at the Durga Puja festival saying, give me fame, give me victory over my enemies, give me this, give me that. So hearing that, how shall they be blessed? Just by being given what they want, or rather by being given the chance to have sadhusanga, the chance to attain bhakti, the chance to be free from the desire that's causing them to pray for those things, which is the actual cause of their dissatisfaction, whether they realize it or not. Under the influence of desire, they think simply the absence of the desired object is the cause of their dissatisfaction. They don't realize that it's actually the desire for an object that's really the thing that's perpetuating their dissatisfaction. So that is a topic we're going to go into further detail on as we discuss this subject. So now we'll look at an example of this in the Bhagavatam itself. So the Bhagavatam is describing this to be Bhagavan's disposition, and Mahaprabhu is summarizing it to be Bhagavan's disposition. So when did Bhagavan actually do this, or where do we find an illustration where Bhagavan does this? We find this in the 6th canto. So a prominent instance of Bhaktas worshipping Bhagavan, offering worship to Bhagavan, with the motive of fulfilling their own personal worldly interests, can be found in the account in the 6th canto of Bhagavatam, wherein the devatas led by Indra, the king of Svarga, seek to destroy an asura named Vritra, because they fear Vritra may dethrone Indra, or support others who wish to do so, and thereby oust the devatas from Svarga. After Indra and his fellow devatas offer homage to Sri Bhagavan and request that Sri Bhagavan kill Vritra, Sri Bhagavan replies as follows. So this Durga Devi stotra, this Argala stotra, the prayer was, please destroy my enemies. Give me fame, give me victory, please destroy my enemies. So here's Indra worshipping Bhagavan and then saying, please destroy my enemy. Please kill Vritra, who I perceive to be a threat to my rule over Svarga, and in other words, to my retaining the means to the forms of enjoyment to which I'm attached. So when he prays to Bhagavan Vishnu with this desire, what does Bhagavan say? O best of the devatas, what is difficult to attain when I am pleased? Nothing. Still, a knower of the essence, one whose mind is one pointed upon me, does not desire anything other than me. A pitiable seer of substance in worldly objects like you does not understand his own good. Now, you can see I've got that like you in brackets. So Bhagavan is speaking politely here. In other words, he's speaking to Indra, saying that one who knows the essence is focused on me and doesn't desire anything else. A wise person who knows the essence of things doesn't desire anything except me. What's the underscript? You should not desire to kill this Vritrasura, right? But, to make it more clear, a pitiable seer of substance in worldly objects does not understand his own good. That's you. So he's not saying this to Vritrasura explicitly, but he's speaking so as to directly imply that Indra is unwise to desire the destruction of his enemy out of his own attachment to the pleasures of Svarga. This is showing that he hasn't really understood what is of true value, what is the real essence of life and experience and fulfillment. So, if someone in my position shall at will give those, meaning essenceless worldly objects, to him, then he too is of such sort. That is, the giver of worldly objects is also ignorant, just like the desirer of them is. So in other words, I can't give this to you because I'm not stupid like you are. Or in other words, if I were to go along with what you're asking me, that would actually imply that I don't have any good sense about what we should do right now. But, you may be deranged right now, but I'm not. So I'm not going to go along with what you want, even if you're asking me for it, because that would actually be unwise on my part and not truly in your best interest. So he elaborates, one who has knowledge of the highest good oneself certainly does not speak of karma to one who is ignorant. In other words, when someone knows what really leads to the highest fulfillment, they don't tell someone to do something other than that. If they know about the path of bhakti, if they know about the path to ultimate spiritual fulfillment, then they don't just hide that from people and tell them to do something far less than that. So he gives an example. An excellent doctor does not administer that which is unsalutary for a patient, even if the patient is desirous of that. In other words, the patient comes and says, yeah, they say I've got diabetes, but, it's not that big of a deal. So, I need some prescribed diet for you because, my spouse is always on my case about what I eat. So give me a document that says I can eat sugar and I can eat potatoes and I can eat rice and, I won't eat too much. So, just tell me to limit it a little bit and I'll be good. You can find this kind of thing sometimes. So, if the doctor wants to just make this patient happy at the moment, okay, here you go. But if he actually wants the person to be healthy, then he has to say, no, I can't write that for you. I can't prescribe that for you because although you might like it at the moment, it's actually going to destroy your health. It's actually going to make you unhappy. So a good doctor here it says, does not administer that which is unsalutary for a patient, even if the patient wants it. So, Indra, even if you want me to kill Vritra, I'm not going to do it because that's not actually good for you, even though you think it is. So, in this response, Sri Bhagavan indicates to Indra that he will not fulfill Indra's request that he kill Vritra, and also explains the reason for his refusal. Sri Chakravartipad further illuminates the meaning of Sri Bhagavan's response in the following paraphrase. So Chakravartipad has a nice rendering of these statements, which reads as follows. Aho! What misfortune and foolishness you all have! Even after praising me with such knowledge, you do not pray for bhakti, and instead seek only that I kill someone you perceive to be an enemy. Although all of you fools, desirous of objects of the senses, do not understand good and bad for yourselves, still, how can I, who am well aware of that, give those, meaning mere objects of the senses, to you all? It is certainly not that a mother gives poison to her sons with her own hands. Because one sees substance, that is, the aim of an embodied being, or a purushartha, only in objects of the senses, one does not understand his own good. So one who thinks that there are purusharthas within the perceptible plane, that any type of mere object of the senses is worthy of being a purushartha, that person has not understood what the real purushartha is, or what's really being meant to be aspired for in life. So one who, although well aware of what is worthy of being a purushartha, shall give those to him is certainly also ignorant. So if I also give you those things, then that just shows that I haven't truly understood what the worthy purushartha is either. One who has knowledge of the highest good oneself does not speak of karma, that is, does not teach the path of engagement or prabritti, meaning advise someone who is ignorant to follow the path of karma, just as an excellent doctor does not administer that which is unsalutary for a patient, even if the patient is desirous of that. Although Sri Bhagavan gives this explanation to Indra, Indra remained intent upon killing Vritra because the influence of the worldly inclinations and desires in his mind was so strong that he could not amply deliberate on what he had heard from Sri Bhagavan, discern what would be best for him, and act in accord with that. So now this is perhaps even the more interesting bit. The fact that Bhagavan doesn't give him what he wants and gives him good advice instead of giving him what he wants, that's important. But the fact that even when Bhagavan himself tells him this, that he disobeys Bhagavan, that he doesn't even listen to Bhagavan and still pursues this, still wants this, even when Bhagavan advises him against this, this is more interesting. In other words, you might say, yeah, I'm struggling in my spiritual life, but if Bhagavan popped out of a cloud and told me all the pure teachings directly, then everything would be great. Well, actually not. It's not that easy. It's not that we're actually lacking in the case of someone who has the fortune of studying the Bhagavatam, of studying the Shastra, of getting a clear education in these texts. It's not that we're lacking a clear idea of what is bhakti. The idea is there, but we can't follow the idea. We can't put it into practice, actually. So why is that? What is it that inhibits us from even acting on the knowledge and the good sense that we ourselves have? This is really where the tension is, or where the binding is going on. So this is where we're going next with the discussion. And it's interesting that we have an example of this so vividly in the case of Indra here in the Bhagavatam, who, does he have any lack of education, any lack of culture, any lack of capacity to dedicate himself to Dharma? Definitely not. You can't become Indra without being a highly principled, highly ethical, highly practical, high caliber person. And yet this type of person, even when getting advised by Bhagavan himself, is still unable to let go of this pursuit, is still unable to clearly consider and then act in accord with the direction that Bhagavan is trying to send him in. So, relatedly, Sri Jiva also elsewhere explains that a human birth is more spiritually advantageous than birth as a devata, because of the intense absorption in objects of the senses that occurs in life as a devata. The import being that when one is deeply absorbed in various forms of sensual enjoyment, one cannot properly deliberate and discern what is best for oneself. So, this point is also important because it shows that it's not that, quote, vishoy, or objects of the senses or pleasurable objects of the senses are just neutral. And that, oh, if we're not attached to them, it's all fine. Or, if we use them for puja, then it's all good. Or if we use them in the name of making a building or making an institution that we claim is all purely about doing worship of a deity or following a set of teachings, or it's all belongs to God and is dedicated to God in some way, then, no problem with however amount of opulence or however amount of wealth or however many amount of luxuries come. No problem at all. Rather, no, big problem. In other words, the more of these things you acquire, the less likely you're able to clearly deliberate and discern how to act on a practical basis in order to progress in spiritual life. There's a literal deluding influence of these objects. Now, it is possible for a highly advanced bhakta to remain immune to that influence. We see cases in the Bhagavatam like Ambarish Maharaj, who was the emperor of the earth, after all, according to the Bhagavatam's narrative. So it's not that the Bhagavatam denies the potential of that, but that's in the case of, who? Oh, Mahajans. That's right. Not like new practitioners who've like brand new to the tradition, in the most infantile state, being told, oh yeah, it's all fine because we're detached, right? It's like the person is like utterly attached. They haven't even hardly begun the process of detachment, and then they're being given a line of thought as if they're, have the level of detachment of a Mahajan. It's like not going to work. So, at being born in Svarga or being born in the midst of a lot of great, worldly luxuries, objects of enjoyment, this can be detrimental to one's spiritual practice, to the faculty of one's vivek, or one's capacity to discern properly and pursue what is truly the Purushartha. So we'll look at why that takes place as follows. Indra's absence of discernment can be further understood by reference to a teaching given by Bhagavan Sri Krishna in Sri Gita, in response to an inquiry from Arjuna as to what it is that prompts people to commit sin as if by force. So this is a very important section of the Bhagavad Gita, because Arjuna, he's seeing Bhishma and Drona and so many other Mahajans and great dharmic people still nevertheless engaging in acts of adharma. Even when Bhishma taught Yudhisthira so many things in depth about dharma in the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata itself, even though all the Pandavas greatly revere Bhishma as a great authority on dharma, nevertheless they can also see that he's still engaging in, to some extent, in a form of adharma by supporting the Kurus and all this. So what is it that is causing people to act or to engage in things that are adharmic, or here specifically the context is a more blunt case of people who are committing sins, even when they know better? So the answer that Sri Krishna gives is as follows. Kamesha krodesha rajaguna samudbhava mahanashano mahapatma vidyanam mihavarinim avairinam Dhumena briyate banir yatha darsho malena cha yatol bena brito gharbas tata tenedam abritam abritam gyanametena gyanino nitya vairina kamarupena kunteya dushpurena nalena cha. So he says, it is kama of Rajagun in origin, voracious and greatly harmful, and it is kama's transformation upon obstruction, anger. Know this, namely kama, to be the enemy here. As a fire becomes covered by smoke and a mirror by dust, and as an embryo is covered by the womb, so this, meaning one's discernment, is covered by that, by kama. The knowledge, meaning discernment, of the knower is covered by this perpetual enemy in the form of kama, which is like an insatiable fire. So the same analogy that was given in the verse of the Bhagavatam earlier, in an earlier passage, analogy of fire. So as a fire is insatiable, the more you feed it, the more it burns, doesn't tire, doesn't wear out, doesn't get old, just keeps burning. Like that, kama burns in the psyche and eclipses one's own discernment. It interferes with, or it overrides, one's capacity to discern clearly and to act in accord with that discernment. So the point is that it doesn't matter how much information you have in your head. You might, memorize hundreds of texts or be able to recite verbatim all kinds of statements like the statements we're reading today. But even with all that information or that theoretical knowledge in one's memory, that doesn't, the downloading into the memory bank of this information and the purification of the psyche such that kama diminishes, those are not the same thing. Those two things don't happen, in direct, they don't have a cause and effect relationship with each other. Rather, you can bring in the information, but then it's the contemplation, it's the using of the faculty of discernment on the basis of that information or on the basis of that theory to then clash with or push into the thoughts and the desires that emerge in one's psyche as a result of one's past karma, one's vasanas, etc., such that one struggles or endeavors to act in accord with what one's discernment dictates on the basis of that accurate knowledge, rather than on the basis of those desires that arise from previous samskars. So there is the clash, so to speak, that's unfolding moment to moment in people's minds as they make the choices that they make throughout the day in and day out in their life. And that's the frontier of the battle, so to speak, if spiritual practice or sadhana based on the Gita is envisioned to be like a battle of forces or something like that. That's the front line, so to speak, where the clash is going on. And so how is it that one struggles to win this clash? It's because, the power of kama can at times, be stronger or override the strength of one's discernment, the strength of one's resolve to act in accord with one's discernment and the clarity of one's discernment. So Baladeva Vibhushan has some nice illumination of these statements of Sri Krishna. So we'll look at his commentary. So he also offers a definition of kama here. This is something that came up in an earlier discussion. What exactly is kama? We had some discussion of that. So here also Baladeva Vibhushan gives a particular definition. He says, kama, that is, desire related to sounds and other objects of the senses caused by previous vasanas. That is, inclinations arising from impressions in the subconscious mind, created by actions performed in the past, impels a person to sin. Kama is that which is extremely fierce and impels one even towards that which is forbidden by means of taking away one's knowledge. Sorry, I think there's an is there. By taking away one's knowledge of, that is, capacity for discernment. Therefore, know this to be the enemy. So kama, here it says, can take away one's capacity for discernment, meaning it can interrupt it or it can interfere with it. In other words, like in modern warfare, someone might have some powerful, missile system that can shoot a bunch of missiles, but if you can somehow hack their software so that they can't actually shoot the missile system, then you don't get blown up, or you don't die from being hit by those missiles, even though the people have the missiles, because they're just not able to use them. So similarly, you might have a bunch of knowledge, you might have the capacity to discriminate, you might know what to do, you might know how to kill kama, but yet you can't do it because before you succeed in doing that, kama hijacks your software. Kama inhibits you from actually using your capacity for discernment that you have. So therefore, it's an enemy, or therefore it's something that is obstructing one's dharmic life in general, or spiritual pursuit. So, although for an ignorant person, apparently a friend at the time of enjoyment of objects of the senses, because of its being pleasing then, kama shall be recognized to actually be an enemy when suffering, the result of that, inevitably occurs later. So this is the other problem, is that the consequences of listening to kama or acting under the dictates of kama often come with a delayed effect. So when something immediately produces pain, it's easier to get rid of it. But if it produces some pleasure and then pain, it's harder to say no. So some people can fail to recognize that it's actually one's enemy, or it's actually highly detrimental to oneself, because it's not 100% detrimental. Someone who, comes along and just steals all your money, then hey, you're someone who's against me. But if someone comes and then does some deals with you, and sometimes does it fair and sometimes takes an extra cut for themselves, such that it's not so clear whether they're really cheating you or not, that person is actually, in one sense, more dangerous, because they can operate for a longer period without being recognized to actually be doing something against you. So something like that, because kama does also create some degree of pleasure for people, then they're thinking, no, this is not so bad, or it's the trade-off is worth it. This is the catch, if you will. So the point that Krishna wants to make here is that you shouldn't sell yourself short. This is, the overall arching principle of paramartik, or spiritual aspiration as a whole, is that yes, there are pleasures in worldly life. We don't deny that. But because they're invariably coupled with suffering and they're inevitably impermanent, they're not worthy of being accepted as the purushartha. Rather, one should make one's purushartha only pure happiness or pure satisfaction, that which doesn't later cause suffering for yourself or others and isn't impermanent. So that sense of sticking to and pursuing what is truly, ultimately most wholesome and best for oneself and others, that is to be, quote, true to oneself, or to really care about one's own best interest. But ironically, it can be hard for people to truly care or truly pursue their own best interest when they have to give up immediate pleasures or immediate minor enjoyments along the way. So that's why it's difficult to recognize that kama is an enemy, and that's why, therefore, these teachings are given to, drill through someone's understanding, or, encourage them or support them in exercising their capacity for vivek, such that they get clarity on this, that they're actually only acting in their own detriment by accepting things that do produce some limited degree of immediate pleasure. So for A wise person, however, even at the time of enjoyment, it is recognized to be only a cause of suffering, because of their inquiry in regard to suffering. So a wise person who's understood the cycle, even at the time when they're experiencing the pleasure side of the cycle, still knows that this is not a real gain, this is not a real benefit, because they understand the whole process that's involved in the inevitable suffering that will also occur. Thus, there is this statement, quote, by this perpetual enemy. Therefore, it is to be destroyed in all respects. This is the purport. So, for someone who wants to achieve Uttama Bhakti, who wants to achieve the supreme superlative bliss of experience of Bhagavan, experience of his Madhurya, experiences of prema for him and all this, then they have to desire that one pointedly, which means they have to give up desire for all other things, which means these desires for other things are detrimental to one's pursuit, and therefore in the language of this context in the Gita, are classified as enemies. And so to achieve that goal, one in the warlike narrative context of the Gita, one has to destroy or slay these enemies. So Bhagavan Sri Krishna, elsewhere in his teachings to Arjuna in Sri Gita, also delineates the steps in the psychological process, whereby even a person who has been taught and knows better still fails to aptly discern and adhere to their own best interest, succumbing instead to the influence of kama. So elsewhere in the Gita, this idea that kama interrupts the faculty of their discernment, what does that really mean, or what are the sub-steps in that process? We see these verses in chapter 2, which lay this out. So, Krishna here, he says, Dhyayato vishayan pungsa sangas te shupajayate sangat sanjayate kama kamat krodo bijayate krodad bhavati sammoha sammohat smriti vibhramaha smriti bhrangshad buddhinasho buddhinashad pranashyati. For a person dwelling on objects of the senses, meaning those things that people are praying for. So in these prayers that we mentioned earlier, Indra's prayer or this Argala Stotra, what are people doing? They're dwelling, quote, dwelling on objects of the senses. They're actively praying for them, seeking them, desiring them, enjoying them. So what happens from that? Attachment to them is engendered. Because of attachment, desire is generated. And because of desire, anger is produced, when inevitably you lose or are denied the object. Because of anger, delusion occurs, and because of delusion, failure of memory occurs. Because of failure of memory, loss of the intellect occurs, because the intellect operates on memory, or in other words, the data set that it's able to process and then dictate, what will be beneficial. And because of the loss of the intellect, one becomes ruined. So I'm giving here Samipad's tika on this, which I thought was nice, and I've highlighted it with a few further points that come from Chakravarti Pad and Baladevi Bhushan to illuminate what he means. So, for a person dwelling upon objects of the senses with the notion of merit, that is, with the mentality that the objects of the senses are possessed of desirability. So this is also important, that this quote-unquote dwelling is specifically taking place when one is seeing these things to have some valuable substance in them. So the implication, as is found throughout the Gita, is that the yogi who's enlightened, he sees that the senses are interacting with their objects and that I'm not the doer, I'm not involved in this at all. The gunas, aspects of the gunas are cycling in relation to each other. I don't have anything to do with this. The detached jnani, the meditator described in the Gita in chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 8, etc., he sees like this. So that person, although they might perceive objects of the senses, is not classified here as dwelling upon them with the notion of merit, or in other words, thinking that the purushartha lies there, or thinking that there's something to be gotten, or something worthy of being focused on there. So in other words, the attitude with which the way that one conceives of the degree of value of the object also determines the level of attachment, the level of desire that comes about in relation to the object. Therefore, knowledge is crucial. In other words, therefore, this analysis, whereby one can recognize that there isn't actually any merit in those objects, is crucial to following this whole process whereby the whole psyche can be reattuned and whereby one can prevent the domino effect that's described here. So, hearing from the Shastra, from the Guru, is the basis of all of this. And acquiring this type of understanding such that one can do this discernment. So, when one lacks those things, this is what happens. For a person dwelling upon objects of the senses with the notion of merit, attachment to them occurs, and because of attachment, greater desire for them occurs. Because of desire, furthermore, anger occurs as a result of obstruction to the fulfillment of one's desire by some means. Because of anger, delusion. So here, this is a significant point. What is delusion, or moha? The absence of discrimination, or vivek, between that which is to be done and not to be done. Elsewhere, vivek is also called sarasar, bichar, to determine what is of the essence and what is of non-essence. So, to understand what one should do and not do is based on understanding what is valuable and not valuable, or where there lies essence and where there does not. So, when one is angered, then that causes delusion, or that causes an inability to do this discernment properly. From that, failure, that is unsteadiness and loss of memory, of that which was instructed by the Shastra and the Acharya occurs. So here you have it, right? If every day we hear some Shastra, every day we hear some Harikatha from a Guru or a Acharya or a Mahatma or a Sadhu or whoever, then we've heard all these things, but we don't follow them. We've heard these things again and again and again, and still they don't actually translate into complete action in our life. So why not? Here you have it in a nutshell. Because there is an unsteadiness or loss of memory. In other words, it doesn't come to mind at the time. Even though you've heard it, even though you might bring it to mind sometimes, at the actual moment of action, that's not what's in your mind. And why not? Because you've entered a state of delusion, or you've entered a state of lack of discernment, because you're running on the influence of this attachment and this desire for these things. So under that influence of that attachment, of that desire, comes an absence of using one's discernment, and in the absence of that discernment, one doesn't bring to mind what one has learned in the Shastra, learned from the Guru, and therefore one doesn't follow it. So from that is, from that loss of memory, that is stupefaction of the intellect occurs. So, in other words, the intellect doesn't do what it's meant to do. It just sits there inactive, or it sits there as though petrified, or as though arrested. So this point I thought was very significant. Chakravarti Pad, he elaborates on Samipad's commentary here by saying that this, quote, stupefaction of the intellect means a loss of right resolve. In other words, one at some point might say, when they recite the prayer we're talking about, I want causeless bhakti, I don't want money, I don't want wealth, I don't want women, I don't want fame, I don't want any of these things. And then we go out and we do activities to pursue those very other things. So why do we at one moment say one thing and then at another moment do another thing? Because when we're taking that other action, we haven't actually sustained the resolve or the sankalpa to do what we said before. So here he's mentioning that this lack of resolve, or this lack of adherence or remembrance of the sankalpa that one has made, to practice bhakti and only bhakti, or to do actions that are favorable and avoid those that are unfavorable throughout one's life, which is the ethic of being a Sharanagata, that anukulyasya sankalpa, that sankalpa to only do what is favorable to Bhagavan, favorable to bhakti, that sankalpa gets lost when the intellect doesn't function, when the memory gets obscured, when the delusion arises because of the pursuit of these objects. And then when one doesn't act according to that resolve because it's not sustained in the mind, then what happens? From that, one becomes ruined. That is, one becomes as though dead. So that's a strong way to put it. He just leaves it at that. He doesn't say anything more. So Baladeva Vibhushan, he adds, I thought, a nice further explanation, saying that one again becomes submerged in enjoyment of the objects of the senses. In other words, it's not that the body literally dies, but that in a dharmic sense or in an idealistic sense, one is effectively dead insofar as one isn't even active or living in the context of living an idealistic or a principled life at that point. So in other words, material engagement of enjoyment of the senses is comparable to spiritual lifelessness insofar as it has nothing to do with spiritual practice or spiritual realization or spiritual progress. So in that way, Baladeva Vibhushan contextualizes this idea of being ruined or dying as just, in other words, leaving the path and going back off into what is conventionally done by those who exist in a state of ignorance or a state of lack of awareness and desire for Bhagavan, for Brahman, for anything of a spiritual nature. Okay, so this topic will continue further. As I said, we're going into nitty-gritty on this, and it's not maybe a fun topic or something like that. It's a bit of definitely a sober thing, but I think it's very important to look at the details of the psychological dynamics of how one's quote-unquote bondage in material existence, or why this material existence in the next verse of Shikshastakam is described like an ocean, why it feels like this inexhaustible entanglement, and so on. All of that language, all those metaphors are actually just talking about this. This is what they're talking about in a detailed psychological sense. This is the reality, is that the psyche is tuned one way and it needs to be reattuned another way. And it's very challenging to come out from the influence of the way it's already programmed. So the struggle to live according to an acquired, refined understanding and then use the faculty of the intellect to act in accord with those ideals and overcome the conditioning that one has, this is the essential struggle that every sadhaka faces, and that all these beautiful teachings and all this beautiful poetry is there to nourish and inspire and support the sadhaka in doing. But to understand the details of what's really the goal of the process and why it is that one struggles along the process, these things are helpful in order to engage in the practice in a progressive and meaningful way, and also acquire a clear sense of self-understanding and also clear sense of where one is at on the path. In other words, it might be better to understand that one's not very far along, but at least clearly understand where one is than to run around acting like one is, or thinking one is, very far along when one actually isn't. So it can also, this type of analysis can also support humility. It can also support that sense of perceiving oneself to be lowly even in the midst of possibly having certain qualities. And that humility is said to be deeply nourishing to bhakti, to inspire genuine prayer, and to be genuinely endearing to the heart of Bhagavan, to the heart of Bhaktas. So even if we hear these things and say, oh, look, this is me, I'm caught, and I'm, subject to all of these struggles and so forth, then just to acknowledge that, just to recognize that, and to simply and humbly carry on to whatever extent that one is able with that clarity of self-knowledge and in a humble spirit, that itself is actually a very blessed state to be in, rather than having some superficial idea about the depth of what this path is and then passionately running around engaging in some, culturally popular forms of bhakti practice in festival settings or these type of things, I mean, people in society might think you're great, or you might getting rather confident about how great you are, but the reality may be something else, and it's only by having this type of education that we can really get grounded and have a sober understanding of what all this language, the depth of what this culture is. And for those who prefer depth over other things, then they may appreciate it. So I'll stop here. I went a bit over, pardon me for the timing. So from here, we'll go further into analysis of the effect of desire on the psyche. We'll look further at what happened to Indra after he prayed to Bhagavan and didn't get what he wanted, how he ultimately meets Vritrasura, and some of the statements that Vritrasura makes are also very relevant on this topic, and also one of them very closely mirrors the statements in the verse of the Shikshastakam that we're talking about. So it's also from two angles spot on with the theme that we're discussing. So we'll look further at this case study, if you will, from the Bhagavatam and more related subject in the next reading. So yes, Vidyaji, I see a question.
Yes, thank you so much. This is a very interesting presentation, because really addressing the devotional struggles, self-assessment and self-analysis. I want to just clarify quickly what sankalpa actually means, etymologically, or because what comes to mind, sankalpa rings bell kind of as being promise. You promise to yourself or promise to Bhagavan that you will obey by those vows that you took. But is there anything else that you could throw into explaining what sankalpa actually means?
Yeah, the word has a little bit of a somewhat broad semantic range. You can see it used in some contexts synonymous with a vow. You can see it used in some cases also synonymous with a desire. So it covers both of these things. So in other words, to make a vow or to form a resolve that I will do this or I pursue this, ultimately one has to have a desire that one is trying to achieve, and then that formation of a resolve is usually related to the means to achieve a desire. So the word sankalpa is sometimes used for both aspects of those two dynamics. And we see it mentioned in classically in the Vedas and in Puranic descriptions of various rites. I'm hearing some scratching. I don't know if it's possible to avoid that.
Scratching.
That every yajna begins with a sankalpa. In other words, when one takes up strictly speaking, even in Hari Bhakti Vilas, when one is going to do any type of vrata, such as even the Ekadasi vrata, then there are procedures whereby one begins the vrata with a sankalpa by saying, in this paksha, over the course of this titi, I will abstain from X, Y, and Z, and I will perform act 1, 2, and 3, and then one, in the presence with Bhagavan as one's witness, so to speak, or for the satisfaction of Bhagavan or whoever the Ishta Devata is that one is trying to satisfy by doing that rite or by doing that vrata, one takes this sankalpa. And then there are statements which even says that a vrata or a kriya or whatever without a sankalpa will not produce fruit. Meaning that if it's sort of like, I'll just do it and then I'll see how it goes and maybe all this or maybe all that, that doesn't actually, so to speak, that's not the spirit of what it's meant to be, but rather the idea is that One is making a commitment, and it's that how it is that quote unquote observance of a vrata is an act of bhakti, so to speak. In other words, it's that you've made a certain commitment to Bhagavan, and then you're following through on that commitment, and that is an act or a gesture which is endearing. So,
but it's not that the essence of diksha actually. When you actually commit to diksha by guru, you naturally lay down the sankalpa.
absolutely.
At his feet. But like now you mentioned this formalization of sankalpa, which is, I think, is very important because it gives you impression on the mind and heart, and the witness is there. Guru, sangha, Vaishnava, sadhus, Krishna, deities, as opposed to just getting diksha, but without that sankalpa. Understand? Like non-ceremonial diksha. Sometimes diksha is given just okay, you want it, okay, have it. But I would see it more as if diksha would be like this ceremonial, grand, not large, but grand, important event that it's emphasized by that, disciple actually committing verbally, visually into that, whatever sankalpa he's going to take. I think it resounds with me, that kind of style of giving diksha in context with what you've just said, as opposed to just, you want diksha? Okay, here it is. You got diksha, good mantra, then go cello next day, right? So that's my little appreciation of sankalpa is and what it does. Now, also, do you mind if I just explain a little bit?
Sorry, what was that?
Do you mind if I extend a little bit my inquiry here?
Okay, sure.
Yes, you mentioned this interesting point that a sankalpa or the following or one's own commitment to the path may be or inability to follow the path of sankalpa may be covered up by personal acceptance or personal recognition, social recognition. Someone who is involved in organizing different things and has a figure, social figure, and is respected for it. So, and people don't see if this person actually follows anything really. And this will, later on in life it shows, the guy was, it was not really pure, and he committed this and that injustice, or appeared to be a fake follower. And then just I find the social circles, as soon as they grow, they create this camouflage environment where people can hide their imperfections behind all the social establishments, or social recognition, prestige, position, appearance. It's so easy to fake the good example, just being on the eye of social acceptance or social exposure. Just want to throw that in. That actually, it is the society may be working again. Just like sadhusanga is important to upliftment, but society, devotional society, may be actually an obstacle for one, allowing someone to be dishonest or faking one's own, performance, I would say, and being praised by in social circles for whatever he does. But actually, in true, the person is not really as dedicated as or pure as it appears in social life. Just I want to throw this in, saying that that's the difference between social, spiritual circle and sadhusanga, what it does and what it does.
Yeah, it's a never-ending balance for individual people. We benefit from association that's actually favorable and progressive for us in whatever stage we're in and whatever circumstances we require. But a lot of times the actual needs and what is relevant to an individual gets lost in the context of just being a quote-unquote member of a particular local congregation or a particular group.
Yeah.
And then people lose track of even their own sense of self and their own needs and their own progressive education and just play along with whatever's going on in some group and don't actually understand how to go deeper into their own practice and their own education. And then even if they do, sometimes they're not provided by that particular place or that particular context with the things that are suitable to them, which is not necessarily the fault of anyone, like in school, there's elementary school and middle school and high school, and there's, different school methods that suit different individuals, and, it's not guaranteed that, like, any place you end up is going to be, like, the one-stop shop that provides literally everything you're ever going to need forever. So, because of all those things, both, from the outside and also from the inside, it can become out of sync or out of tune with what is really nourishing to that particular individual. So as much as it can benefit us, it can also become, a crutch or an obstacle or something else. So it's up to the sincerity of individuals and the depth of their education to be able to discern what is beneficial for them and how they can progress and how they can participate meaningfully in spiritual community in a way that doesn't become camouflage or doesn't become a perpetuation of anarthas, but actually supports them in really overcoming the anarthas. So it's difficult, it's a challenge for everyone.
I know, because see, the thing, everything boils down to we play so in living this body, we play with our sincerity and social obedience. I think this is something like that we are social beings for sure, but we are responsible for ourselves primarily. And unless we are like acutely, like 100% sincere, and which may actually be antisocial, or it could be appears as being antisocial because of somebody's sankalpa. Someone may really end up really choosing living outside of the society. Spiritual society, and then actually, I want to maybe like one step further. I can take it without trying to judge anything, but I can see like all these great sadhakas, Siddha Mahatmas in Vrindavan. Though they went to the jungles, they ran away even from people in Vrindavan, right? Like Trikodi Baba, he lived in the places that are completely uninhabitable, full of scorpions, snakes, exposed, like outskirts of Vrindavan, kind of, like it's extreme, but after all, we're responsible for ourselves only. Anyway, that's one thought.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Jai Shri Radhe. Excuse me. Yes, did you have another thing?
No, I'm done. Thank you so much. Pranam.
Okay, then the other hand.
Pranam Baba. I don't know if we still have time for my question. Is it still okay or is it too late?
Well, if you estimate it's elaborate, maybe not. If it's not too elaborate, then maybe we do.
I'll try to be like as succinct as possible. So my question is, as a sadhaka, how can one protect oneself from falling prey to this delusion or these desires, which, for example, like in my case, for 10 years almost, I have been hearing Harikatha. I have been trying to practice Bhakti yoga. I have been trying to do my sadhana, read my japam, read shastra, but still, like, I have these persistent desires. Like, I noticed that I have this persistent desire that I'm struggling to get rid of, even though, like, I'm trying. And for example, sometimes it seems like, okay, I got rid of this desire, thanks Lord. And I like going on, and then after some time passes, some things happen, and like I'm looking back at myself and I'm thinking, oh no, I still have this desire. I have not even like succeeded to getting rid of it. And I was like, I remember I've heard something in psychology research about it, some psychologian talking about the desires, and they were saying something like that it's impossible to get rid of the desire if you try to suppress it or repress it. Like, if desire becomes repressed, it's still there, it's not uprooted, but it's just like repressed, and it's not good because it's like it comes in the future, it comes back. So my question is how to protect oneself, how as a sadhaka, what is like some practical maybe advice you can give how to be in this situation?
Well, there's some verses in the 11th canto which we've discussed in the past, which are applicable in this context, where this phrase jatta shraddhamot katasu nirvina sarva karmashu veda dugatmakan kaman parityagi panishvara tato bhajetamam prita shraddhalur drida nishchaya dushamanashchatan kaman duko darkamshcha garhayan, where Krishna is saying that if someone has shraddha in me, they're disinterested in other pursuits, and they know that objects of desire or desires, meaning worldly desires, cause them suffering. But then still they can't give them up. Parityage pyanishvara. Even though they know it, they can't stop. So he says, what should that person do? He says, tato bhajeta mam pritya. That with affection or love, they should worship me. In other words, they should try to do their bhakti sadhana with their heart, with good heart and good feeling and good faith. They should try. Shraddhalur, being endowed with shraddha, and drida nishchay, with firm certainty that this is their goal, not saying, a bit of this and a bit of that, but with clarity that this is their ultimate goal, with clarity about why this is their goal, with faith in that goal. They should try with their heart to serve me. And then he says, Jusha manash chatan kaman. And they will acquiesce to those desires. Meaning, he's not saying, and now 100% never again act on any desire, right? Because if a teacher gives an instruction that the student can't follow, that's the fault of the teacher. In other words, the teacher has to give the student a set of practices that are realistically actionable in their life, that they can make progress. So if it's too easy, that's a fault. If it's too hard, that's also a fault. It has to be calibrated such that the person can actually practice it and actually progress by practicing it. So, excuse me, here Krishna is saying that the person is not going to be able to give this up immediately. So they're going to acquiesce to these desires sometimes. It's going to happen. He's not surprised by it, neither are we. It's not unknown to any of us. We don't need to pretend like it's not there, or just dress up on Sunday as if we're perfect and act like we don't never do anything else. It's just a reality. We may struggle with, whether it's gross material desires or just subtle things, whatever the case may be in our personal life. But dukangs darkangs chagarhayan, one should also recognize what happens. In other words, when they acquiesce to those desires, they should also pay attention. And as they're doing it, they should try, just like what we're reading in the Gita, where he's saying there's the loss of discernment, the loss of memory. So what he's saying in the Bhagavatam is, try to remember, even when you're getting carried away, try to recognize that this is actually ultimately causing you suffering. Don't just get carried away by the pleasure of it that comes immediately at the moment. Try to bear in mind and look at it lucidly as a holistic process. And so he gives this advice, and then he says, Praktena bhakti yogena bhajata masakrin mune, that the person should do this type of bhakti yoga that I've taught again and again and again. They should practice it repeatedly. Kama hridaya nashyanti mai sarve hridi stite. And that the kama, the desires in their heart, will be destroyed eventually, gradually. That kama will be purified from the heart. When that heart, when their mind becomes fixated upon me. So Chakravarti Pad gives the analogy as though Krishna is like light, and wherever light appears, darkness disappears. So the more that Krishna is kept in mind, the more that one becomes attentive to Krishna or, Krishna conscious, the more that light, the more that presence of Krishna will dispel the presence of kama. So we try, and sometimes we acquiesce, sometimes we still act on these other desires. There's another verse of, where Krishna says, Bhadyamano pimad bhakto vishayir abhibhuyate, that although obstructed by these desires, my bhaktas are not defeated. In other words, he knows that they're going to struggle, so they are going to sometimes do things that are quote-unquote hypocritical or self-betraying or contrary to their own ideals. It's going to happen, and they're going to suffer for that. they're going to undergo difficulties when they do that. But even though that happens, he says, but they don't lose. They're in other words, if you go into a war, you go into a boxing match, it's not that you never get hit. Like you take some hits, but you ultimately win the match. So, it's like we can't expect to come along into this challenge and then never take a hit. It's like if you're the running back in some American football match and they hand you the ball and then it's like, oh wait, these guys are trying to tackle me. It's like, dude, they're gonna try to tackle you. And the whole game is to try to run for the end zone, even though they're trying to tackle you, and break the tackles. And the great guys are the guys that break the tackles and, push on and, bounce off and spin and, all this to not get dragged down by it. So something like that, we have all this stuff going on in the psyche, all these sanskars are coming up like linebackers, goosh, goosh, and then, if we can, take the hits but not go down, so to speak, then, he's saying, tibrena bhakti yogena, that by the strength of their practice of bhakti, although they're obstructed or although they take hits, in my football analogy here, they're not defeated or they don't lose the match, they don't lose the plot, they gradually overcome it. So, sometimes we may feel demoralized if, we're suffering from a bunch of hits in a short period of time or what have you. So we don't want to be too much focused on how many obstacles are coming up, because we don't want to lose our enthusiasm or lose our desire to keep trying. So sometimes it's better to just take it day by day and take it simple and not worry too much about those things. Just try moment to moment to do our best. And then at other times, there's also a place for some degree of some, self-critical analysis and some attempt to say, look, you need to do better, you ought not, do this or do that, you should know better by now, you could do better by now. So we don't want to be too hard on ourselves, but we don't want to be too lenient on ourselves either. We want to just strike a balance where we can stay steady, and realistically, in most cases, this is more like a marathon than a 100-yard sprint. So, we want to set a pace that isn't too gradual, but at the same time is not too much that we burn out or that we, fizzle out due to false hopes or whatever. We just want to be steady and strong as we're able and keep going with our practice and overall have faith in the purifying power of the path of bhakti itself, of all the manifestations of Bhagavan that are in our life. Bhagavan has personally come into our life in the form of the holy name, in the form of our Ishta Devata, in the form of our Guru, in the form of the Bhagavatam, in all these ways he's come and he's graciously giving us all these teachings, graciously giving us all this beautiful things, the beauty of his names, the beauty of his deity forms, the beauty of his teachings in Bhagavatam, the beauty of his leelas, all these wonderful, wonderful, sweet, sweet, beautiful things. So if we can, cherish and recognize the profundity of that grace that's already in our life and cherish that and culture that in the midst of the obstacles and the struggles that we have, then we can stay nourished and stay strong and try as we're able.
Thank you, Baba. Thank you very much.
Is this that's why is it stated that devotee never falls?
Yeah, can be seen in that way. Name bhakta pranashyati in the Gita you're referring to, right?
Yes, so there's no question of falling because you're on the track. You might fall, but your mind is always forget it. Despite whatever's going on, you always have one target in mind. Right?
Exactly. I mean, in the context of that statement in the Gita, what he means is that my bhakta will, the previous statement, bhajate mam ananya bhak, he's speaking about that person who worships me, not any other. In other words, who's accepted me as their object of worship and has that one-pointed fixity upon me. Then he's saying that person will never fall from this path or will never perish. In other words, they'll never leave me as their Ishtadevata or as their object of worship, because insofar as they worship me, that much they'll surely be fulfilled and blessed and enriched by that, so no inclination to do that will ever happen. But if we talk about fall down in maybe like a modern moral normative sense of someone who, engages in some activity that's considered a dharmic, the way someone might say, oh, so-and-so monk went off and got drunk or went off and got married, he fell down, From that type of speech is not the fall down that's being spoken of there. For a person to do those things, that doesn't have anything to do with quote-unquote falling from the path of bhakti or not. If someone, due to some samskar, engages in some type of worldly enjoyment like that, that doesn't mean they've fallen from the path of bhakti. That just means they've acted according to some material samskar for some period of time. But if they, maybe, get distracted for a minute or a year or, in a span of eternity, how long is how long? It's not even that long, That doesn't qualify from these shastric terms as a quote-unquote fall down.
Right.
But a person who in their heart decides, no, I don't even want to be a bhakta of Bhagavan, that's what's spoken of as quote-unquote falling down, that they literally reject the path.
Yeah. So the fall down is basically referring to falling off from the path of bhakti and taking some other path, like bhavatād or good worship or something like that. Okay. So as long as someone is targeted on bhakti, despite even having internal dialogue, oh, I'm so long here, already nothing works for me, but I'm still on the path, and whatever happens, whatever, but I'm still on the path. I cannot give it up, but I'm so fallen. I cannot, I don't know if I achieve any goal this life, maybe many lifetimes, but still I'm on a path because I don't see any other path. But I feel I'm completely, way unqualified. So that could be not considered a fall down, although the consciousness may be really remorse and helpless almost, to the point of oh my God, what's happening so long and I'm still nowhere, But I cannot give it up.
Yeah, so definitely. That is not nowhere near what we would call falling down.
So this doesn't happen in other paths like karma or jnana. It doesn't happen like that. And from there, it can easily fall down, right? Is it not?
Yeah, I mean, in the karmic context, to engage in those contrary actions can constitute a fall down, because the path of karma is itself, based on doing and adhering to those type of activities.
Yes. Thank you. Jara, thank you.
Jai Shri Radhe. All right, well, we're a bit over time today, so I'll conclude here if I may. And if we're so blessed, we'll dive deeper into this analysis of desire and prayer and purification of the psyche in our next discussion. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Radhe.
Jai